Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements. And here we're going to engage as many sides as we can. One of the problems with left wing media is that it has a tendency to get into an internal feedback loop and also has cycles, and even different platforms favor different tendencies depending on the way the algorithm treats the tendency. Twitter, or X as it is now called, for example, in addition to having moved pretty far right wing, from what I can tell, going back on the channel, also encourages actually more radical politics from the left because it engages in outrage cycles. Also may reflect a natural disillusionment with the state of both the progressives and the democratic socialists, particularly since they tried the merge in the last decade. But you see these things in various faces. There's more quote ultra left positions on Facebook, probably because those people are a little older. There's more standard social democratic stuff and anarchist stuff on Instagram and TikTok, from what I can tell. Now, that's all anecdotal. None of that has a whole lot of real steam as far as like me proving any one of these things has a trend. This is just the way the algorithms feed me. And I don't act too differently on any of these sites. And in fact, lately I kind of avoid them. But going into Substack, what I would say is I've been reading a lot of more diverse opinions and whatnot to get a better feel of what's actually on in the broader universe. And I have found a lot of interesting stuff out there. So this brings me to this piece, Intellectual Courage as a Scarcest Resource, by Ruxandra, I think I'm saying that right, Teslo. Teslo is a genomics PhD student at the Sanger Institute in the UK. She does pro-progress, anti-safetyist commentary on scientific and cultural matters from a genomics PhD candidate, attempting to shape the culture towards optimism and abundance mindset and freedom. Now, that codes to me as liberal to libertarian. So I would not say that Ruxandra and I would share politics, but I read this piece and it was suggested to me by a friend whose politics I also don't share, and was actually quite impressed with it in some ways. It's from a little while back. It's back from June, back when Biden was still sundowning in front of the nation, and we saw a lot of intellectual and moral cowardice from people who've forgotten that the people that they're supporting, that they're asking to support them now, were hiding things from the general public not that long ago. So I wanted to talk about this because it's going to also get into some other things like audience capture, when your audience captures you and you get into a feedback loop to rile them up and continue attention. Peer pressure. Not all peer pressure is bad, actually. I don't want to sound like a 90s high school teacher. But you can definitely see that peer pressure plays a role. Purity test, anti-purity test, which can move from virtue signaling to vice signaling, which is also a thing that is probably under discussed. The way mutually constituted feedback loops between groups will lead to virtue and vice signaling in one way or the other, most of which is a very superficial intellectual game. So let's get to Ruxandra Teslo's Substack piece here and get into the substance of what I want to talk about today. Let's make this bigger for the visually impaired. And, that includes me. All right. Intellectual courage as the scarcest resource. Were we ever brave? I mean, my answer is most people have never been brave. Today, Nate Silver had a good piece arguing that the Democrats have basically shot themselves in the foot by ignoring Biden's signs of obvious decline. Now, from the standpoint of September from July, oh, the world seems so different. I had made mispredictions on this myself, partly because I couldn't imagine that people would forget how we got to the situation. But nonetheless, people have forgotten it, or perhaps they're too afraid of Trump to own up to it, or perhaps everyone's getting depoliticized because there's been so little movement in any direction, and the hard walls of reality are hitting a lot of people differently. Instead of facing reality, funny that, they preferred to lie to themselves that the very legitimate words about his age were down to misinformation spread by nefarious actors. I would go so far as to say that while I don't always love Matt Taibbi's politics and all that, they were right that was a little bit more than convincing themselves that the concerns were just misinformation. The partisans were doing that, but the leadership were actively courting the misinformation. Yet ultimately, reality caught up with Biden and the Democratic establishment, and now the party is pretty much stuck with a candidate that stands a very slim chance of defeating Trump. Asterisk, not today. They have a candidate who has a slightly less slim chance of defeating Trump, as in is over him in general polls, but it's still pretty much a coin toss when you look at individual swing states. Thank you, Electoral College. I'd like to add another point to Nate's analysis, namely the role of intellectual courage, or lack thereof, had in this. A lot of people, including journalists, public intellectual staffers, and the list goes on, can see the truth with their own eyes, but refuse to openly voice their opinions due to fear for their career. I've talked about this even in terms of the debate between Harris and Trump, where the interviewers were basically softballing it the entire time, are the moderators, allowing the time-tested American tradition of, for fear of losing access, not asking politicians, leaders, and journalists hard questions. You can even see this today in the Financial Times and Forbes, where being in the 30 under 30 is probably a good indication that you're going to be in prison for fraud in the next decade. But nonetheless, here we are. Ruxandra Teslo, quoting herself on Twitter, as I keep saying today, the scarcest resource in today's world is courage. I would say that's always true. Nick Field, an A-plus Democratic Senate source of mine, reckons that of the 51 Ds, no matter more than half a dozen believe he is still has a plausible chance in November and want him to stay in the race. The ratio is on the House side, as best I can tell, is roughly the same. I mention this because if I had to choose a failure mode of our current intellectual epistemic environment, it would probably be a lack of intellectual courage. Yep. Although I would ask, why is there such a lack of intellectual courage? Well, there's the systemic protection of elites in the fact that they basically, we're no longer dealing with the elites that built the system, bloody, violent, and whatnot that it is. We're at least confident. They may have been foxes and not wolves, but they were good foxes. Today's foxes are their inbred Nepo babies, I suppose. The Biden situation is one example that happens to have very outsized impact and impact more and more people are waking up to. So that's why I chose it as an opener example. But the consequences of intellectual cowardice are much often less obvious. And frankly, I would add, most people don't know they're doing it. Tiny and scattered all over the place as they are, it's easy to ignore them. But they do add up to create an intellectual environment that's bland, stultified, and worst of all, incapable of guiding people to the truth. The truth emerges via constant argumentation, something that cannot exist if everyone is afraid to say what they think. As a result, I think intellectual cowardice, as well as educational polarization, is at least to some extent to blame for what Matthew Yglesias described as the problem of elite misinformation. Now, lo and behold, to give one of the journalists I hate most in the world, Matthew Yglesias, any credit, but in sake of intellectual honesty, he has a good point here, as much as I would be loath to admit it. This is from his slow, boring Substack, something that I only read when I want to raise my blood pressure. Elite misinformation is an underrated problem. The whole notion of misinformation is conventionally construed as taken some blows lately, including scandals in the misinformation research field, and more importantly, some great work from Brendan Nyhan, Emily Thorson, and the co-authors showing that in a review of behavior science research on online misinformation, we document a pattern of I'm going to just go to the of low exposure to false and inflammatory content that's concentrated on a narrow fringe with strong motivations to seek out such information. From where I sit, that's all to the good. I've been explaining for years the problem with this framework as an explanation for political outcomes. It is true that there is fringe content circulating on the internet. There's been fringe content circulating everywhere. Did people watch television in the 80s and 90s? Do you remember Ancient Mysteries and Unsolved History, or the entirety of the History Channel, or TLC after it got removed from its original scientific and learning mission and they realized they couldn't profit off of that forever? They started peddling bullshit. I mean, or is that just because I'm old? Anyway, even before me, the 70s Time Life weirdo books. Anyway, it's not the idea that misinformation being peddled by the media is new. It's just absurd to me. And even in the high point of the legitimacy of news, which I'd probably say from Walter Cronkite to Dan Rather, so from the mid 60s to the 80s, when the baby boomers were coming up and being all annoying, news may have held itself to that standard, but anything that didn't have that imperator was often a fucking joke. The internet just made the distinction between what's a fucking joke and what is catering to your biases and what is true a lot harder to parse. But I've never seen it as the existential threat it's often presented as in center left and center circles. After all, if people believe bullshit, you have to start asking yourself why, other than they're stupid. All right. Back to Yglesias here. It is true that fringe content circulating on the internet and also some of your political enemies probably believe some of it, but there's little reason to believe that such content exerts an important causal influence on American politics. That said, the one complaint I have about misinformation paradigm is that even in its debunking forms, it uses a generic term in a highly specific and somewhat particular way. People have a lot of erroneous beliefs about the status quo in the United States, and that seems to matter. These beliefs are not normally formed via exposure to some kind of social media information. They're just about things that aren't in the news very much and that people misunderstand. Asterisk. I tend to think that the average person by themselves doesn't make great decisions, but that the average person in aggregate does. But only when they have good information, and there's no reason for them to have a collectively highly emotional response to it. So, for example, the aggregate of the general population tends to be smarter on general questions than specialists on questions that aren't their specialty. Even if they're highly educated, they're not highly educated outside of their specialty. But any individual versus a specialist is probably going to lose. However, that aggregate knowledge or aggregate ability to kind of suss out the truth goes away the more people are highly emotively polarized when asked the question. And also, if they don't have good inputs, they probably don't have good outputs because we don't really know what their priors are in the situation. To go back to Yglesias, I wasn't expecting to read most of this Yglesias piece, and I am really loath to place it in the show notes, but I will. Which is to say, people having information that is not correct is absolutely a huge deal in politics. It's just not necessarily misinformation in the sense that the misinformation police intend. In Dylan Matthews' profile on the State Department's small but very successful intelligence bureau, for example, one thing that comes through is that the bulk of American intelligence agencies generally believe that Iraq had advanced nuclear weapons program. Yeah, that surprised me. That the intelligence people believe their own bullshit. It's kind of like thinking about the Bush lied and millions died thing, and the more horrifying thing is, no, Bush was incompetent, as was all of his regime, and millions died. And in some ways, that's a harder pill to swallow, even for me. All right. This erroneous information had a huge impact on the media, on the mass public understanding of the political debates in 2022, 2023, and decision making in Washington, and then on the broad trajectory of American politics. And I think the erroneous idea that it was perpetuated by the mainstream institutions, what I'm going to call elite misinformation, is a really big deal in an underrated way. I don't want to rehash this in detail because it's been real covered recently, but a good example of this sort of misinformation is the narrative about the huge rise in maternal mortality in the United States. Because as a growing chorus of critics has been pointing out, the increase was largely a mechanical result of a change in the counting methods, not in the public health situation. A lot of those weird statistical blips actually happen because we changed the way we do statistics. That's bad. And what's really shocking from I learned from Jerusalem Dimasa, I think, is that the key actors are totally unapologetic about sowing the confusion. Quote, Christopher M. Zahn, the interim CEO of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, wrote a lengthy statement in response, arguing that reducing the U.S. mortality rate crisis to an overestimation is irresponsible and minimizes the lives lost and families that have been deeply affected. Why? Because it would be an unfortunate setback to all the hard work of the healthcare professionals, policymakers, patient advocates, and other stakeholders being examined. Rather than pointing out other major methodological flaws in the paper, Zahn's statement expresses concern that could undermine the laudable goal of improving maternal health. We often, so fucking often, argue about stating truths from the consequences of those truths. So much. And yet, usually protecting people from the consequences of truth doesn't go that fucking well. I think about when the CDC and NHI pulled a bunch of bullshit on masks, which turned a lot of people against masking. Now, the effectiveness of paper masks was always understated, but masking has been shown to be effective in Asian countries way before COVID. And yet, to preserve masks for those who need it, they lied about the efficacy, and they knew it. And then they backtracked and didn't admit that that's why they totally did it. It was really frustrating because even NPR and other people were saying, oh, they were just trying to protect. No, they weren't. It was a lie. It was a lie that was maybe a benign lie because they didn't want to rush on equipment needed for hospitals and whatnot. But it had an effect later on that increasingly strewed distrust in the health system. Now, a lot of those people would have distrusted the health system anyway, but you added fuel to the fire. Anyway, this strikes me a short-sighted and pernicious way to think about the purpose of communicating with the public, and yet people out here are saying it in public. The case of the mystery fossil fuel subsidy. Years ago, when I didn't cover climate and energy topics at all, I floated the idea of a piece making the point that not only were carbon tax proposals politically toxic, but all of these various schemes to subsidize clean energy seem to be a relatively inefficient way to reduce fossil fuel use. Wouldn't it be better to just set global government to cut the massive subsidies for their fossil fuel use first? Yeah, I've wondered that myself too. God damn it. I hate agreeing with Matthew fucking Yglesias. Anyway, after all, I've seen a lot of stories from headlines like this. Fossil fuel firms are subsidized at a rate of 11 million per minute. Mother Jones. Why are the taxpayers propping up the fossil fuel industry? New York Times. Why are governments still subsidizing fossil fuels? Washington Post. Explainer. Global fossil fuel subsidies are on the rise despite calls for a phase out. Reuters. But even though these scandalously high subsidies were widely covered in the mainstream press, nobody really would follow the basic logic of them. If fossil fuels are receiving massive subsidies, then by far the best and most growth-friendly way to decarbonize is to cut the subsidies. On one hand, yes, this information made me feel more strongly than ever that the world should decide to act decisively on climate change. And at the same time, though, it made the actual policies being pushed by the mainstream environmental groups seem kind of weird. Why not tackle the subsidies? Yeah, why not? It turns out that these stories about subsidies, though widespread, are incredibly misleading. Uh-oh. They're based on an annual report put out by the International Monetary Fund, whose most recent edition is headlined, "The Fossil Fuel Subsidy Surged to a Record $7 trillion." And that's a lot. But let's check out the fine print on the chart. This is a chart, by the way. You can see it going up in 2015, going down slightly in 2016, up a little more from its 2015 level in 2017, up significantly in 2018, up a bit in 2019, going down in 2020 because everything did, shooting back up to higher than the 2019 levels in 2021, and going up a lot in 2022. This is from the IMF. But let's look at the note. Figures from 2019 onward use projections for fuel use. Explicit subsidies undercharging the supply costs. Implicit subsidies undercharging the environmental costs and foregone consumption taxes after accounting for pre-existing fuel tax and carbon taxes, but they only do that after 2019. The vast majority of subsidies then are implicit subsidies, which include undercharging the environmental cost. And in other words, they are characterizing the government's failure to impose a carbon tax as a subsidy for fossil fuel use. As a thought experiment in the textbook chapter on externalities, I think that's a perfectly sensible formulation. And to some extent, I think the point that the IMF is making here is dead on. If the world governments came together to get each state to locally impose a carbon tax equal to the global social cost of carbon, that would raise approximately $7 trillion in revenue. And that revenue could be used to reduce outstanding public sector debt burdens and to reduce broad taxes on consumption and labor. In aggregate, the world would end up with much cleaner air and a much more stable climate. And the economic cost of doing so would be minimal or even arguably negative. And as I've written before, the carbon tax is in fact a good idea, but the challenge of climate policy is it involves difficult coordination problems, because for any one country, setting a carbon tax at a global social cost of carbon would be too high. But instead of explaining itself clearly, the IMF is putting out misleading headlines, which are then picked up and bounced around by the mainstream media outlets, asterisks, who often do not read the fucking footnotes. Actually, I'm just going to, in general, even scholars barely read the footnotes and often repeat things in secondary sources that are wrong in later scholarship. Oh my God, have I seen it since I started this channel and really started going through and teaching this stuff slowly myself and being amazed at what people get away with in higher academia right now. But that's another rant. In the context of misinformation studies, this probably wouldn't count as misinformation if someone believed, because they read the New York Times write-up of an IMF report that, quote, around the world, taxpayers are helping to support fossil fuels through subsidies when their money could be funding green energy transitions instead. And in fact, to the credit of the New York Times article in question, the 9th paragraph of the story does explain what's going on, but the whole beginning of the article makes it seem like we're talking about direct subsidies. And because there are non-zero direct subsidies, the rest of the article discusses why those are politically difficult to scrap in countries that have them. Similarly, the IMF explains what they mean when there is fine print in the chart. They're not lying exactly, but it's hard to understand why the IMF would do this unless they thought it was a good idea to trick people. Let's go back to the original piece here. So back to Ruxandra Teslo's piece. As an academic, this whole situation bothers me. I see the role of an intellectual as being about defending truth. I mean, if we can agree on what defending truth means, which we can't at all, but honestly, attempting and pushing for that is what intellectuals are supposed to fucking do. Radical, I know. I know it is idealistic of me, but what's the point otherwise? Well, the point otherwise is training people for jobs, being regime apologist, tying yourself up in endless knots of grant money. I don't know. Anyway, the extent to which academia suffers from the issue was made clear to me after I started writing on the internet. I got a lot of DMs from academics, often with much more job security than me, who tell me that they agree with this article or the other, but they cannot say it because of X, Y, or Z reason. Asterisk, I know tons of people in elite universities with fucking tenure, which is supposed to create intellectual freedom, who are afraid of getting yelled at in a meeting and thus keep their mouth shut. This is the environment that over administrated universities plus tenured professors who also depend on increasingly graduate students and barely minimum wage making adjuncts to support their fucking 2-2 loads while they're doing research and getting grants in for their programs, basically rent seeking half of their career, while they're trying not to cancel each other, particularly in humanities departments at elite universities, because that's what they have time to do with their fucking lives. Of course, that breeds cowardice. But also, when you think about it, what are the stakes here? The stakes here are because these people's reputations are in small groups where reputational damage really matters, and even tenure won't necessarily protect you from that. Similarly, why does this happen so much in journalism as access? Why does it happen in independent journalism? Like myself, I guess I'm not a journalist anymore, never really have been, even though I thought I was going to be one when I was a youth. Wanted to be a science journalist, in fact, then a lawyer. 2 grave mistakes on my part. But anyway, now don't get me wrong. It's totally normal to keep your opinions on some topics private. Yeah, you should keep a lot of your opinions private. That's not a lack of courage. That's sanity. But I'm talking about things that are often adjacent to their work and which are not even that controversial. For example, this happened a lot when I wrote about why the premise behind misinformation studies is fundamentally fraud, and from academics doing social science related stuff. If people are afraid to voice their opinions about this relatively milquetoast topic, it seems to me like we are in a bad place in terms of our ability to openly criticize idea. And if you do not believe me, then you should check out this piece by Matthew Yglesias. God damn it, Ruxandra, you're gonna make me say something else nice about Matthew Yglesias, aren't you? You are really going to give me a heart attack. Where he reports the same thing happening to him. Well, let's look at this by Matthew Yglesias. I'm going to also have to link this too. Can Uncle Sam fix the cost of living? All right, let me share this with you. I got to change my screen here. I'm going to prove my commitment to truth by saying nice things about a person whose scholarship historically I have hated since like he started writing for Slate in the mid-aughts, 20 years ago. Anyway, can Uncle Sam fix the cost of living? Plus a Colombian saying about crows. This week, I am recommending Steve Tellis' essay Beyond Academic Sectarianism, which pleads with the American professor community to take the concerns about ideological homogeneity on finding the purpose of the university seriously. Yeah, I think so too. I'm tired of dealing with milquetoast liberals. I would only add that the very gentle way in which his critique is framed underscores how bad the situation is. There is an incident recently where a young left-wing historian named David Austin Wallace complained about being a white man was hurting his odds of getting a tenure-track job. This attracted a lot of public condemnation, and he apologized. And a week or so after he apologized, 7 different white historians expressed to me in private that Walsh was correct about this and that the criticism he received was unfair. I have less than zero information about the contemporary hiring practices in academic history departments, so I have no idea whether these guys are white. What I do know is that the whole point of tenure as a practice is that scholars who have it are supposed to be able to speak their minds without fear. Yet we at people who believe in a relatively powerless young scholar as being unfairly maligned for saying things they believe to be true, yet they're afraid to stand up for him because to do so would be buckling the local left-wing consensus. This particular incident is not actually a big deal, since absolutely everyone involved agrees that the field of history has much bigger structural challenges. But the casualness in which people tell me about which I thought Walsh's complaints were correct, but of course they could never say so in public, during a whole the instance in which truth-seeking function at the university has been compromised. Cool. I don't have a lot to say about that. I would say tenure is a vicious cycle when people apply for it, and that all kinds of people will use all kinds of social leverage to get rid or around it, to make sure that people they don't like get it. And I'm sure all kinds of racial categories in all directions are used. I think it would vary on the institution. But it is interesting to me too that people are afraid of social responses so significantly that they won't say something about it, even if I don't know, or I don't even know if I agree or disagree with the statement. No, I don't have to praise Matthew Yglesias for this. So, don't have to condemn him either. All right, back to the piece here by Ruxandra. 2 types of courage. It is popular these days for certain types of anon accounts to post memes beginning with the sentence, "Men used to go to war and now insert lame thing that happens in the modern world." This kind of meme almost takes it for granted that there was a time when people, or in this case men specifically, were courageous, a time that has irreversibly passed. But were we ever brave? It seems to me that there are 2 types of courage: high potential upside courage and low potential upside courage. Going to war or taking part in any form of physical confrontation, at least for the nobility, has a high potential upside endeavor. Yeah, because the nobility literally existed to do that. At least the nobility and the aristocracy. I mean, before the democratization that technology brought to weapons, weapon systems required you to spend most of your time learning how to use them. And unless you also did that as your means of securing food, like, I don't know, Asian steppe raiders or something, that was going to require a fuck lot of people doing labor for you, so you could specialize in getting really good on wielding a big sharp metal thing on your horse, because that's not an easy thing to do. As a person who's ridden horseback and has played with sharp metal things, it would actually take you a little bit of time to learn to do. Being a good marksman takes time and skill, but not that much comparatively. And this was even true with English longbowmen, which required a lot of time to make the longbow and a fair amount of skill and practice, but it was way more democratic than other forms of warfare. And so people who were not necessarily knights could be trained to do it. Now, this kind of historical material analysis I don't get from the historical materialists that much these days, because it would risk actually having to know something about something other than Russia, and specifically between 1880 and 1925. But nonetheless, yes, there are a lot of risk involved, but there's also much gain. But what has to be gained was tangible and widely reinforced by society: status, something we all crave. And status in that count and honor in the form of tokens came with it access to potential mates. It came with it the ability to collect taxes and not work. So the status we all crave also came with very material benefits. All right. It wasn't just capricious consumption status there. It is not some subjective thing dependent on deep conviction. I think we still have this type of courage in our society. It's rare, indeed, but it's not impossible to find. It's rare because the stakes are higher. Warfare sources are more lethal. I don't care how strong and brave you are, you're not going to stand up against a cluster bomb. So, there you go. And while this does not manifest itself in people going to war, it shows up in those who take risks to pursue ideas with low probability of success, but huge upsides in terms of status. If you follow me, you probably recognize that I'm talking about the world of startup founders. Oh boy. All right. I was with you, Ruxandra, until here. I believe that startup founders does have a huge risk, bravery, reward in a time when venture capital is not throwing money at it, but we live in a time when venture capital is throwing money at it. Quitting your cushy job to pursue a life of a founder requires a lot of courage with a lot of comfort to lose, but almost with the promise of very tangible rewards for success. I mean, that's fair enough, even from my bourgeois hating ass. Our startup founders are the warriors and kings of old. Not if there's a lot of venture capital money protecting them from a fall, my friend. But then again, maybe that is true because the warriors and kings of old were also living off the backs of peasants and their peasant bow shooting that protected them when they raided the other side. So maybe this has a truth to it that Ruxandra doesn't really see. But I'm still with her in the broad scheme of things, even though this is really going to show a difference in our politics. What we do lack, though, is a courage that has low potential upside, that is not much to be gained from it. And I am increasingly convinced this type of courage has always been even more rare than the high potential upside type. I mean, wouldn't it logically be more rare? It requires one to not only have a high risk tolerance, but also ignore one's self-interest. Two traits that are rare to begin with and even rarer together. Yeah, they'd be rare together because in many cases that would be suicidal. But, you know, I think Ruxandra Teslo gets it here. It requires one to be sort of a Joan of Arc of intellectual life. And you know how Joan of Arc ends. Which is not to defend the intellectual cowardice. I do think we need more Joan of Arcs. But the thing is, we know how the story ends. You don't want to be Joan of Arc and you don't want to be Giordano Bruno. Like, you're dead. And also, often those people are way weirder and more cranky than we let on. But anyway, being intellectually honest about the topic you're academic or journalistic or any other type of intellectual college you disagree with falls into the low potential upside courage bracket. Usually. There's stuff to be lost, but relatively little to be gained. Yep. Stuff to be lost, access. Stuff to be lost, reputation. Stuff to be lost, not being canceled. What's worse is you're more likely to not even be rewarded, but the dignity of being openly canceled. Mostly your career would just become a bit shittier with your open disagreements you have, a dreary slog that you cannot even wear the badge of honor of being canceled about. It tells you being canceled doesn't work if it's a badge of honor, but that's neither here nor there. You'll become that which the most ambitious people fear, a no name. Fear the most, a no name. And you won't even be able to tell where this comes from to point to a culprit. If you are even a tiny bit ambitious, the calculus is clear. Shut up and agree. You'll need to be a bit mad to do it. This makes me think if we want more intellectual courage, we cannot just assume it will spontaneously emerge from nothing. I don't mean to be rude, but no shit. We need to actively incentivize it and nurture it and to nudge towards it, looking more like high potential upside type of courage. But the question is how? It's a big question indeed. Despite that little bit about startup founders who, as the bourgeoisie go, are actually somewhat ambitious, but I wouldn't say I mean, if I'm saying they're the knights and kings of our society, that might be brave, but they're also kind of parasites. Although the startup founders probably deliver a little bit more than just a mafia-like protection ratchet. So maybe there is an argument for them, but only a little more. And again, as venture capital or QE makes it cheap, it's not really that risky, is it? But beyond that minor point, there's a lot of good points in this essay. And god damn it, it made me have to give Matthew Yglesias credit for something, which you got to be special to do that. The reality of the situation is we have never been intellectually courageous, and certain kinds of intellectual courageousness are usually comorbid with other kinds of insanity. But we need those people. We need to nurture them, protect them, and protect them from their own often cranky insanity too. How do we do that? I can tell you the culture of the left doesn't really do that right now. It doesn't really not. It's more just a niche antiquarian society in some ways at this point, depending on what kind of leftist you are pretending that you're standing against the status quo while also supporting it. One of the most duplicitous things I think I've ever dealt with. But the problem with that is it's self-duplicitous. Even things that people think are a brave stance, like voting for Jill Stein, it's not really that brave at all. They're all voting's literally the least you can do. And what you're doing there is voting your moral compass, which is fine, and you should. You get no complaint from me there, but that's not really building a politics in any substantive way. But people confuse it for that. They confuse talking truth to power as courage, and maybe sometimes it is. But I would go back and tell people to read more about the Cynic virtues of parrhesia, which I know I'm mispronouncing, or even Foucault's writing on it. Lo and behold, I normally don't suggest reading Foucault, but his stuff on this is actually quite good. That parrhesia has power when it also has consequences. Speaking truth to power matters when power will shoot you. And you really, truly do have to be almost a Diogenes, a Sinope, to truly not give a fuck. And maybe your insanity will see you through. But for most people, that's too dangerous. How do we protect that? How do we make brave thinkers? Not just in the academy, but in the world. I don't have an easy answer either, but it's something I increasingly think a lot about because I found myself being captured in the past all the time. Sometimes people will accuse me of it where they're actually just accusing me of disagreeing with them. I find that to be a particularly shitty way to go about things. Oh, you just do this because you want people to approve of you. That's not the way I go. And you can get captured by any sort of audience, including a contrarian one. That's not exactly what I'm speaking about here. Because sometimes the biggest person you're going to hurt with your own realization of truth is going to be yourself and your own priors. But that's what you should do. All right. I'd like to thank my Kano Kahan and Trey for supporting this episode. We have all kinds of tiers to support on Patreon. You can get access for as little as $3 a month. But if you don't have the money, that's fine. I produce a whole lot of stuff for free for you guys too. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment. You can listen to the interview show for free if you don't want to watch it on YouTube. You can find it on any major podcast player, I think, except iHeartRadio. For some reason, iHeartRadio is really hard for me to get on. But almost everything else, Apple Podcast, Overcast, Stitcher, Spotify, they're all available for you. So I hope you enjoy this attempt to challenge you to develop intellectual bravery and read people you dislike. Read bravely. No reason to feel attacked. Text can't hurt you if you protect yourself appropriately. Protect your peace.